When the Switch released in 2017, the gaming landscape changed forever. Nintendo created a new hardware category, the hybrid console. With the introduction of the Switch, portable gaming's limitations vanished overnight. Big open worlds and breathtaking visuals were no longer limited to the big screen, and players fell in love to the tune of over 150 million consoles sold. Having created one of, if not the best-selling console of all time, means that just about anyone could imagine Nintendo was looking to pull off a repeat performance. But the question on everyone's mind was, could they pull it off? Would Nintendo recreate the success of the Switch, or would we see another Wii U-style failure? Now that the Switch 2 has landed after 8 long years, we can begin to piece together the answer to that question. The Switch 2 is as familiar as it is new. Looking at it, it's undeniably a continuation of the Switch family, but it's simultaneously something completely different, both inside and out. Nintendo has rethought the Switch from the ground up. Everywhere you look, something is wildly different. And most of the time, the changes are pretty great. The first thing you'll notice is that the Switch 2 is substantially bigger than its predecessor in nearly every way. It's much longer and much taller, but just about as thin. The body houses a massive 7.9-inch 1080p display, nearly 2 inches bigger than the original Switch and just shy of 1 inch bigger than the Switch OLED. It's a really great display too. It supports both HDR and variable refresh rate, meaning games are vibrant and smooth in handheld mode. Despite being an LCD, the Switch 2's display renders blacks well and displays games with a level of color accuracy rarely seen on non-OLED panels. While I would have loved for Switch 2 to ship with an OLED panel in place of this one, I don't find myself feeling like I need more from this display. It's bright, accurate, has great viewing angles, and its inclusion of VRR and HDR means that games will, for many players, look far better in handheld mode than they will on their TV. The display takes up most of the front of the Switch 2 with redesigned Joy-Con on either side, which Nintendo has dubbed Joy-Con 2. Joy-Con 2 now use magnets to connect to the console with an extremely satisfying snap. The connection is solid too. You can dangle a Switch 2 by a single Joy-Con without fear of it coming off of the console. This is thanks to the SL and SR buttons on each Joy-Con now being made of metal. Nintendo originally considered adding magnetic Joy-Con to the original Switch, but opted not to, as in their original tests, the magnets were unable to support the weight of the console. Clearly, Nintendo's improved that here, as the Switch 2's Joy-Con feel almost impossible to accidentally remove. Just like the console itself, Joy-Con 2 are substantially larger, sporting bigger, colorful, not Hall effect sticks that have a very smooth travel to them, supporting a range of motion that feels much further than that of the Switch 1 sticks. And there's a new C button on the right Joy-Con for game chat, and they're just as packed full of tech as the originals. Rather than an IR camera on the bottom of the right Joy-Con, Joy-Con 2 instead featured these little optical sensors in both the left and right Joy-Con, allowing for mouse control in both the firmware and supported games. At first, I thought this would be used only for obvious things, like aiming in shooters or selecting units in RTSs, but developers have already done some inventive and interesting things with it, like this minigame in Bravely Default where you use both Joy-Con and mouse mode simultaneously to pilot an airship, or manually dragging blocks in Puyo Puyo Tetris 2S. I really can't wait to see a future WarioWare title make use of this. The Joy-Con 2 also have greatly improved HD Rumble, which Nintendo is calling, perhaps predictably by this point, HD Rumble 2. It's a bit early to form any strong opinions about HD Rumble 2, but it's used to great effect in Mario Kart World as you feel the vibration of the steering wheel in your hand as you accelerate, or the impact of a shell against your cart. The technology here is impressive, rivaling that of the haptics found in the PS5 DualSense controller, but it remains to be seen how developers outside of Nintendo will use it. HD Rumble wasn't utilized very well by third parties on the original Switch, though in an era in which all three major console manufacturers are using some type of advanced haptics in their controllers, developers have more incentive than ever to capitalize on Nintendo's updated take on the technology. Nintendo also introduced an updated Pro controller, and it might just be the best controller ever. I'm torn on whether I love this or the PS5's DualSense more, but it's incredibly well built. It's got this smooth feel to the plastic that's just so nice. I've never felt anything like it, and it doesn't have a side seam. Nintendo really over-engineered this, and I love them for that. The buttons on the Pro controller are very clicky with just the right amount of travel, but both the Pro controller and the Joy-Con get better battery life than the PS5 controller, which is a trade-off I'm happy to make. Even better, if you get the Joy-Con charging grip or the Pro controller, you get access to the GL and GR buttons along the underside of the left and right grips that let you remap them to any button. They let you do things like remap the dash and jump buttons in Breath of the Wild, eliminating the claw grip we all used in 2017. There's also this webcam. I've been using it mostly to chat with the rest of the GVG crew. It's neat for what it is, but there isn't really a lot to say about it. Around the back of the Switch 2 is a redesigned kickstand that's kind of hook-shaped. It's a thin, narrow bar that extends out from the back of the machine, and while it doesn't look as though it should be able to hold the console well, in my testing it's been easy to adjust and holds the Switch 2 up without any issues. You can even adjust it by pressing a single finger against the console without any unreasonable force. It doesn't scream stability the way the slab-style kickstand on the Switch OLED does, but it appears to work just as well. Underneath the kickstand, there's a familiar port that takes a not-so-familiar card. If you want to expand your Switch 2's storage, you'll need to purchase a microSD Express card. These cards look almost identical to the microSD cards used in the original Switch, except they're much faster. About 4 times faster, in fact. The Switch 2 doesn't work with older microSD cards, as Switch 2 games read from the microSD much faster. While microSD Express costs more, I'm happy to make that trade-off for shorter load times in my favorite games. It's hard to understate just how nice it is to see dramatic load time reductions. Just look how much more quickly games load on Nintendo's current-gen console. It's bonkers! Quick loading isn't just limited to games either. Nintendo has dramatically improved the eShop's loading times on Switch 2. The original eShop was just a mess. It was so slow, I would often give up and just look at games online instead of browsing via my console. This is thanks in part to Nintendo optimizing the eShop's back-end servers, but also because the Switch 2's built-in wireless card is so much better than that of their last-gen console. I used to get about 75 megabits per second on the Switch 1, now I get up to 320 over wireless on Switch 2. Finally, on the Switch 2's top, we've got a new USB-C port and a new card slot. I'm still trying to figure out the point of the top USB-C port. You can charge the Switch from either its top or bottom port, but beyond that, it seems a bit silly to include one up there. The top port appears to be limited to USB 2.0 speeds, meaning lots of accessories won't work, though you can hook up a webcam to use for game chat, which I'll talk more about a bit later. The game card slot is essentially the same as the Switch 1, albeit much easier to open. The card slot on the Switch 1 always made me feel like I was going to break the Switch, my fingernail, or both. But this one is thankfully painless to get open. It accepts these new red Switch 2 cards. They're the same size and shape as the original Switch cards, but they also read data much faster. Nintendo's done some clever branding here. Switch 2 games are distinct in color, but you can still plug them into a Switch 1. Exclusive games like Mario Kart World will throw an error up, but this copy of Breath of the Wild? It'll work just fine, loading the Switch 1 edition of the game rather than the Switch 2 edition. And just like the original Switch models, Switch 2 comes packed with a dock for connecting to your TV, and I'm not a big fan of it. The Switch 2 dock is okay. The console sits inside it without issue, and there's an aggressive curve to the back of the dock that reminds me of the iPhone 3G. Aesthetically, I think it's fine. My issues with it, however, are twofold. The slot on the back of the dock for routing your cables is just too narrow. If you keep the back on the dock, it can feel like you have to pull your cables pretty far downward to get them out. The dock also has a concerning amount of give when you squeeze it. You're probably asking yourself why you would squeeze your dock, but I did it by accident. I was trying to plug a USB headphone transmitter into my dock's USB port on the side, and I felt the Switch 2 dock start to give as I was holding it steady so it wouldn't slide while I tried to plug the headphones in. I didn't end up damaging my dock, but I'd love to feel like I wasn't going to from doing something so basic. There are some strange software choices Nintendo has made in docked mode as well. VRR isn't available in docked mode even if you have a compatible display, which would go a long way towards smoothing out how some games appear, but ultimately that's going to affect a small percentage of players. HDR, however, is much more ubiquitous, and it's kind of a problem on the Switch 2. When you connect the Switch 2 to an HDR-compatible TV, you'll be asked to adjust the image to your liking using this brightness slider. The problem is, if you don't have an HGIG-compatible display, which is a gaming-focused version of HDR, you can't really properly calibrate HDR for Switch 2, resulting in a picture that looks just kinda off somehow. Also, and I know this is a minor gripe, but maybe don't put the HDR settings at the bottom of the display settings when you have the HDR settings for handheld mode at the very top. I can't be the only person that got confused by that. Anyway, back to talking about the dock. The dock isn't all bad. One thing I'm grateful for is Nintendo finally adding Gigabit Ethernet to the Switch 2's dock, which is super helpful for downloading larger games. The Switch 1 dock topped out at about 100 megabits per second, or 10% of the speed of the Switch 2 dock, or at least it did for me, and that's a huge upgrade. Under the hood, Switch 2 is packing 256 gigabytes of internal storage, up from the 32 gigabytes in the original Switch launch model and 64 gigabytes in the OLED. The storage is paired with an NVIDIA T239 system on a chip, with more than triple the RAM of the original Switch, but you wouldn't know it when you first boot up the console. The Switch 2's user interface is largely unchanged from that of the Switch 1. It's still a somewhat Spartan home screen with large menu icons and a function bar along the bottom giving you access to things like the eShop and your Nintendo Switch Online info. The difference is that all of these things are far more responsive than they were on Nintendo's last-gen platform. Like I said before, the eShop loads up almost instantly, and navigating between game pages no longer feels like you're using dial-up internet. On top of that, Nintendo has added 2 features to Switch 2 that set it apart not just from its original incarnation, but from other hybrid consoles: Game Chat and Game Share. Game Chat is clearly Nintendo's top priority with Switch 2, enough that Nintendo added a button to their controllers to access it quickly. Game Chat is, as its name suggests, a way to chat with your friends while you play a game. Think of the party systems we've known on competing platforms, add a touch of Zoom, the video chatting platform that exploded during the pandemic, and you'll get the idea. Game Chat supports up to 12 players at a time in a party and allows you to share your screen. You can also hook up an optional webcam to your Switch in that top USB-C port or into the dock to share your camera feed while you play. Some games will integrate with Game Chat to allow players to see your camera feed in-game, albeit with some weird limitations. Mario Kart World, for instance, will allow up to 4 consoles, with up to 2 players each showing their faces in Game Chat, for a theoretical maximum of 8 players out of a possible maximum of 24. I assume this is to prevent lag, but it's such a strange way to do things. Weird limitations aside, GameShare might be my favorite implementation of a party chat system to date. Sure, you have to verify your phone number, but I imagine that'll curb bot activity, which has run rampant on PSN and Xbox Live for years, and once configured, it's easy to drop in and out of chats with friends, and the Switch 2's built-in microphone works well enough for most use cases. If it doesn't, you can hook up a number of other USB microphones and headsets to get a little more flexibility out of your Game Chat setup. You can even use old iPhone earbuds if you still have a 3.5mm set laying around and plug them into the Pro Controller too. While I love Game Chat, GameShare may just be the Switch 2's coolest new feature. As its name implies, GameShare lets you play games online with others even if they only support local co-op. The only downside is that you can only do this with games that have had support patched in. GameShare works by streaming your Switch 2's screen to another player over the internet or local wireless and letting them play as though they're the second player in the room with you. And for some games, the second player will get a unique view that you can't even see. So far I've only found this in Clubhouse Games and Captain Toad, but this changes how I'll play those games. I've already started playing through Captain Toad with my wife over GameShare, and I've played some Clubhouse Games with John despite the fact that we already have several stunning Switch 2 games. There's something about GameShare that feels like it shouldn't be possible on a handheld console. The idea that someone can remotely play Super Mario Odyssey with you feels like cheating. Speaking of games, at launch, Switch 2 has a library of 19 games between exclusives and Switch 2 editions of previously released Switch 1 games, and in addition to that, Switch 2 is backwards compatible with over 15,000 unenhanced Switch 1 games. The games are always going to be what makes the difference, and Switch 2 has a great lineup of both new and old titles to choose from, but for the first time in a long while, we have to take the power under the hood into consideration when talking about just how these games fare. The Switch 2 frankly puts any other hybrid console currently on the market to shame. Cyberpunk 2077 looks so much better on Switch 2 than Steam Deck that it isn't even fair to compare them, and the same can be said for Switch 2 editions of games running against their original counterparts. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom run at 60 frames per second while rendering at 1440p versus 900p on the last-gen console. Games like Street Fighter VI, Hitman, and Yakuza perform so closely to their PlayStation counterparts that the difference can be hard to tell in motion. Sonic X Shadow Generations runs at a higher resolution and a better frame rate than the PS4, putting it squarely in competition with the PS5, where it holds up surprisingly well. Kunitsugami, Nobunaga's Ambition, and Civ 7 use the Switch 2's mouse mode control to give players a taste of what PC gamers have been enjoying for decades players can experience in the console landscape. Nintendo has bet the Switch 2's fortunes on one marquee title, however, in Mario Kart World, and I have mixed feelings about it. We've already reviewed Mario Kart World here on GVG, and I largely agree with our assessment of the game, but taken in the context of a console launch, I can't help but feel Mario Kart, and by extension the Switch 2 itself, is missing something. It's undeniably fun, and I'm really enjoying my time with it so far, but it doesn't feel like the kind of game you have to have. Instead, Mario Kart World feels like a complement to some other game you would pick up a Switch 2 for. That is to say, there's no Breath of the Wild for Switch 2. Well, except for, Breath of the Wild. The Switch 2 might be missing a killer app, but it also might just not be. For me, so far, the selling point of Nintendo's new-gen console is just how well it plays last-generation games. Just about every marquee title on the original Switch looks and runs better on Switch 2, even without the full Switch 2 edition treatment. Super Mario Odyssey's draw distance is dramatically improved. Captain Toad gets online multiplayer via game chat. Splatoon 3 looks so much sharper and has improved frame rates. The list goes on. Switch 2 makes original Switch games shine. Even some games that didn't receive upgrades, like Bayonetta 2, now perform at 60 FPS thanks to their uncapped frame rates. For years, I've grown used to seeing games perform at lower resolutions and frame rates, but I was willing to write that off because I was playing on a portable console. But now, those issues are gone. That feeling of holding an impossible, powerful console in the palm of my hand is back. Seeing a portable get close enough to modern consoles that the difference between them is negligible gives me hope for the next generation of games. That's why we're giving the Switch 2 a 9 out of 10. Nintendo has always owned the portable gaming market, and with Switch 2, they've expanded their lead even further. It isn't without its flaws, but when you sit down and actually play, it's just too easy to forget about them and lose yourself in the experience. It's impossible to know where the next few years will take us and how history will remember the Switch 2. What we know now is that Nintendo silenced their critics in 2017, and right now, there's no reason to believe they won't do it again.